Hi everyone, my name is Karen, this is my channel RatherBeReading, and today I'm bringing to you my Around the Year in 52 Books Challenge wrap-up. In 2018, one of my reading goals was to complete the Around the Year in 52 Books reading challenge. So this is a group that is on Goodreads. I'll link it down below for you guys if you guys are interested in checking it out. And basically the idea of it is that there's a challenge for every week of the year and you try to complete the challenges throughout the year. I don't do it week by week. I just take all 52 challenges and try to check them off throughout the year. I just find this is a lot of fun. Most of the books I can check off, most of the challenges I can check off with books from my shelf. Some of them you have to do a little bit of digging, and I find that even the research into what books meet the goals to be a lot of fun because I'm a nerd like that. But it was a goal that I was successful with. I did complete the challenge in 2018. So this is a wrap up of, I'm just going to go through all of the challenges, what book I used for the challenge, how it meets that challenge if necessary, if it's not clear. And yeah, I just thought, I know a lot of people will think this video is boring, but I find these type of videos really, really interesting. So let's jump straight in and talk about all of the challenges and how I checked them off. A quick note before we jump in, I'm not going to be putting pictures of all of the books on the screen because it would just take me forever in editing and I don't think it's necessary. If I have to reference something on the cover, I'll put it in so you guys can see what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to be holding up books or putting pictures in because I just don't think it's necessary. So apologies if that annoys you guys. Also apologies if I'm looking down a lot. I've got all the challenges set out on my laptop, so I'm going to be looking down. That's just how this video is going to be. So let's jump in. So the first challenge was to read a book with the letters A, T, and Y in the title for Around the Year. So for this, I used Reality Boy by A.S. King, which actually had A, T, and Y just in the word reality, which was really great. The second challenge was to read a book from the first 10 books that you added to your to be read list. So this was really easy for me because I have a challenge to read those books already as one of my other reading goals. So for that I used Defending Jacob by William Landay. The next challenge was to read a book from the 2017 Goodreads Choice Awards. For that, I used The Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them screenplay by J.K. Rowling and some other people probably. That was won, I think, the fantasy category in 2017. The next challenge is an interesting one. There were 4 challenges that will all come up throughout. You'll see when we get there, but they were all linked. So it was to read books linked by the 4 elements. So there's earth, air, wind, and fire, obviously. So the first one was to read one for earth. I chose World After by Susan E. World, earth, you get it. The next challenge was to read a book about or inspired by real events. For that, I chose Are You There Alone by Suzanne O'Malley. This is a book it's a true crime. It's about Andrea Yates, who killed all of her children. And so I used that one for that. The next challenge was to read a book originally written in a language other than English. For that, I used The Little Prince by Anton de Saint-Exupéry, which is originally published in French, I believe. The next challenge was to read a Gothic novel. For that, I used Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. The next challenge is to read an Own Voices book. For that, I used When Dimple Met Rishi by Sandhya Menon, which is Own Voices for Indian representation. The author is Indian, the characters are Indian. The next challenge is to read a book with a body part in the title. For that, I used Jaws by Peter Benchley because jaw is a body part. The next challenge was to read an author's debut book. For that, I read The Dollhouse by Phoebe Morgan. That one happens to be a debut. The next challenge was to read a literary fiction book. For that, I read The Almost Sisters by Jocelyn Jackson. The next challenge was to read a book set in Africa or South America. For that, I read Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Okparanta, which is set in Nigeria and is actually Own Voices for being set in Nigeria. The characters are Nigerian, the author is Nigerian. The next challenge was to read a book with a plot centered around a secret, be it forbidden love, spies, secret societies, so on and so forth. For that, I read Exile for Dreamers by Kathleen Baldwin. This is a book that is all about spies and like a school for girls that are basically training them to be spies. So that one worked perfectly. The next challenge is one of those ones that I was mentioning before that are linked by the elements. This one was for the element of fire, and for that I read Fire with Fire by Jenny Han and Siobhan Vivian. The next challenge was to read a book with a unique format or writing style. For that, I read The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. This one is unique in its writing style in that it's one of those books where you're being told the story like in the past. So it's the character saying this is what happened and telling you the story. That's not unique in and of itself, but within that we have the other characters. So there's one main character that's telling you the story, and then you've got other side characters piping in and going, that's not how it happened like this, and arguing back and forth kind of like in the margins, I guess it would be. I listened to it on audio, so I'm not sure how it appears in the physical format, but it's a unique writing style in that. Well, at least I think it is, and that's why I use it for that challenge. Excuse me. Excuse me, frog in my throat. The next challenge is to read a narrative nonfiction. For that, I read, sometimes it's confusing to me what counts as narrative nonfiction, but I looked up lists of narrative nonfiction and this book was on there, so I'm counting it. And that is Stiff, The Curious Life of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach. The next challenge is the one that I used a wild card for, so you can use a wild card and not complete that challenge. The challenge was a book you expect to make you laugh. I don't read a lot of like comedic fiction or like books that I think are going to be funny. I did have a book picked out for this, which was Yes Please by Amy Poehler. I own that book, but I really want to listen to it on audio. And so I'm glad to have the physical one because I'm sure it's going to have pictures and things that I can look at, but I really want to listen to it on audio, and I haven't been able to get my hands on an audio copy. So I just didn't end up reading it. So I ended up using my wild card for that one. The next challenge is to read a book with a location in the title. For that, I read The Lost Girls of Camp Forevermore by Kim Fu, with Camp Forevermore being a location. The next challenge is to read a book nominated for the Edgar Award or by a Grand Master author. So for that, I read Armadale by Daphne du Maurier. Daphne du Maurier was named a Grand Master author in 1978, so that one counted. The next challenge was to read a book rated 5 stars by at least one of your friends. This one is pretty easy to check off, so I ended up using The Cursed Child by J.K. Rowling and Jack Thorne and John Tiffany, I don't know, by some other people. I think there are a couple of people that I am friends with who had rated this 5 stars on Goodreads, but one of them is definitely Aoife from Fred Weasley Died Laughing, I believe. I believe she'd rated that one as 5 stars. The next challenge is to read a book written in first-person perspective. For that, I chose Choosing Charleston by T. Lynn Ocean. The next challenge is to read a book that you have high expectations for. For that, I chose Born Wicked by Jessica Spotswood. That whole trilogy is one that I thought I was really going to like, and I was right. I did really enjoy that trilogy. The next challenge was to read a medical or legal thriller. I read The Brass Verdict by Michael Connolly, which is a legal thriller. Next is to read a book with a map in it. I read War Storm by Victoria Aveyard. The next challenge is to read a book with an antagonist or villain point of view. For that, I read Lie to Me by J.T. Ellison. The next challenge is to read a book with a text-only cover. For that, I read Fearless 14 by Janet Ivanovic. I'll put a picture of the cover here so you guys can see. The copy that I had read was from the library, but it does have a very clear, like it's just the text, colored text over a colored background. There's no like interesting pictures or anything on that cover. The next challenge was to read a book about surviving hardship, for example, war, famine, major disasters, serious illness, etc. For that, I chose Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys, which is set during World War II. The next challenge was another one of those elements challenges. This is for the element of water. For that, I chose The Lake House by Kate Morton, because lakes are made of water. And the next challenge was to read a book with a clue weapon on the cover or in the title. So lead pipe, revolver, rope, candlestick, dagger, wrench, you get it. For that, I chose Cards on the Table by Agatha Christie. Again, I'll put a picture here for you guys to look at for that one. There is a dagger on the cover on the edition that I read, so I used that one to complete that challenge. And then the next challenge was to read a short book. For that, I chose Love Bites, 101 Tips for Dating Guys with Fangs by Claire Hooper, which I hated, but it was 190 pages, so it was very short. The next challenge is to read a book set in a country you'd like to visit but have never been to. For that, I ended up using Still Me by Jojo Moyes. There's like hundreds of books that I could use for this because I want to visit basically any book set out of Australia I could use for this, but this one in particular, it's set in New York, and the reason I chose it for this challenge is because the way it was written, I mean, I wanted to always visit New York anyway, but New York was very prevalent in it, and it was, you know, very much the setting of New York was really prominent within the story, and it made me really want to go to New York, even more than I already had before, so I used that one for that challenge. The next challenge is to read an alternate history book. For that, I read That Inevitable Victorian Thing by E.K. Johnston. which is set in a future where the British Empire didn't fall. So that's an alternate history. The next challenge is to read a book connected to a word born the same year as you. So this is really a confusing challenge. So basically they had, I think it was a website that you could look at, and you could look at the year you were born and find out words that basically that became a word that year, which is an interesting concept in and of itself. So this one, I felt like I kind of maybe have cheated a little bit. Like, I don't know. So a word that I was born in 1988, and the word ebook was first used apparently in 1988. So I just used The Blackbird Season by Kate Moretti because I read it as an ebook, and ebook was invented that year. So I think a lot of people maybe would have found this really hard challenge, but because of the whole ebook thing, it ended up being fairly easy for me. The next challenge is to read a suggestion from the previous year's, from the polls. So to set the challenge for that year, they do a bunch of different polls where you can vote on different challenges. And then the challenge for this one is to pick one of the challenges that didn't win and complete that. So for this one, I chose the challenge of a book with a fruit or vegetable in the title, and I ended up reading Plum Lucky by Janet Ivanovic for that one. The next challenge is to read a book featuring a murder. I read a lot of books that feature murders, so for that one I just ended up using The Lady by His Side by Stephanie Lawrence. The next challenge is you had to read a book that's been published in the last 3 years that's from an author that you've never read anything from before. So for that one I used There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins. That book was published in 2017 and I'd never read anything else by Stephanie Perkins before. The next challenge is to read a Women's Prize for Fiction winner or nominee. For that, I read The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which was on the long list for the Women's Prize in 2012. The next challenge was to read a science book or a science fiction book. For that, I read Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. The next challenge was to read a book with a form of punctuation in the title. For that, I chose P.S. I Still Love You by Jenny Han, because the P.S. has the periods in it, so I used that. And the next challenge was to read a book from Amazon's 101, I think it's just 100 books to read before you die. No, 100 books to read in a lifetime, I think it is. And for that, I read The Secret History by Donna Tartt. The next challenge is to read a book from an author who has the same first and last initials. For that, I read Fracture by Megan Miranda. The next challenge is to read a book that takes place in or underwater. In or underwater. For that, I chose Fathomless by Jackson Pierce. This is one that I was really nervous about, that I didn't know I was going to be able to read anything to check off. And I was really excited that I ended up reading Fathomless, which is a Little Mermaid kind of retelling, and huge portions of the book are set in the ocean. So that really worked for that one. The next challenge is to read a book that's the title of the book is a whole sentence. For that, I chose This Is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. The next challenge is to read a ghost story. For that, I read Ink and Bone by Lisa Unger. The next challenge is to read a book that intimidates or scares you. For that, I read Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, because that book is almost 1,000 pages, so that's a little bit intimidating. The next challenge is to read, again, it's the final one of those elements challenges. This one is for the element of air. And again, I read Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. Wind, air, I thought that one would work for that. The next challenge is to read a book where the main character or author is of a different ethnic origin, religion, or sexual identity other than your own. For that, I chose the Doubt manga collection, volume 1 by Yoshiki Tanagai. Both the author and the characters in that are Japanese, and I am not. The next challenge is to read a book related to one of the 7 deadly sins. So for that, I chose Sweet Evil by Wendy Higgins, which works for basically all of the sins, because the premise of that story is that they're children of demons and they all embody a deadly sin. So literally every sin is in that book. So that one really, really worked for that challenge. The next challenge is to read a book from the Goodreads Best Book of the Month list. So I think for every month there is a list of like the best books for that month. I don't really know how those books are chosen, if it's an official Goodreads thing or if it's voted, I don't know. But I looked at those lists and I ended up reading Across the Universe by Beth Rebus, which was on the list for January 2011. The next challenge is to read a book with a warm atmosphere, being it centered on family, friendship, love, or summer. For that, I chose To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Arhan, which is kind of focused on both family and romantic love, and I liked both of those aspects to that story. The next challenge is to read an award-winning short story or short story collection. For that, I read The Grown Up by Gillian Flynn, which was the winner of the Edgar Award for short stories in 2015. And then the final challenge for the Around the Year in 52 Books challenge for 2018 was a book published in 2018. And for that, I chose Lethal White by Robert Galbraith. So that was the Around the Year in 52 Books challenge and all the books that I read for all of those challenges. Like I said, I don't know if anyone else finds this interesting. I really do. I find it really fun to, like I said, I really enjoy looking into all of the individual challenges and trying to figure out books that fit those challenges. I think it really takes you out of your comfort zone a little bit. Like I said, some of them are really easy and some of them are a lot more difficult, and I think it's a lot of fun. So I would love to chat with you guys in the comments down below if you've got any thoughts on any of the challenges. Which one do you think would have been hardest to check off? Because some of them were pretty difficult, I'm not gonna lie. So yeah, I would love to chat with you guys in the comments down below. Please like this video if you liked it. Please subscribe if you want to see more from my channel. That is all I have for this video today. Bye guys.